Hey Satterton, this is Mr. Dubik here, and in today's lesson what we're going to be talking about is the process of photosynthesis. Now the process of photosynthesis is very complex and contains many different steps, so I thought it would be good to kind of just take a day and give you all a general overview of photosynthesis. So with that said, what we're going to be talking about is what is photosynthesis. Next, we'll be looking at the balanced chemical equation of photosynthesis. So what are the reactants needed for photosynthesis, and then what does photosynthesis produce? Next, we'll talk about where does photosynthesis take place in photosynthetic organisms. So not only does plants go through photosynthesis, so do algae, some protists, as well as some bacteria. So the process of photosynthesis is super important for many living organisms. And then lastly, we'll take a look at the two different steps in photosynthesis, the light-dependent reaction and the Calvin cycle. Alright, and lastly down here I have a cool picture of a map of the world, and really what it's showing is that photosynthesis takes place all around the world. If you look at all the continents, there's a green color, and that's just showing you that photosynthesis is taking place everywhere, which is super important for all living organisms. Not only does photosynthesis occur on land, but it also occurs in the ocean, which is very important because there's a lot of aquatic plants in the ocean that go through photosynthesis, which is super important as well. Okay, so I thought this map was super cool in showing you where photosynthesis takes place, and it takes place all over the world, whether it be on land or in water. Alright, so in this slide what we're going to talk about is what is photosynthesis. So by definition, photosynthesis is the process by which plants use energy of sunlight to convert water and carbon dioxide into glucose and oxygen. Right. So if you look at the diagram below, you see a simple diagram of the process of photosynthesis. And we're going to first start with sunlight. So sunlight is going to be absorbed by the top layer of the leaf, okay, because remember, one of the top layer of cells in a leaf is called the palisade mesophyll, which contains a whole lot of chloroplasts, which contain chlorophyll, which is the green pigment found in plants that attracts sunlight. So sunlight is going to be absorbed through the top layer of the leaf. Okay. Next we have carbon dioxide, which is going to be diffused through the underside of the leaf through the stomata. And then also we have water that is going to be absorbed by the roots of the plant, and then it's going to travel up through the stem, through the xylem, to wherever the plant needs water. Okay. Once we have those three reactants, what we're going to produce is oxygen, which is required for animals and humans to breathe, and also sugars, okay, which is we call glucose, which is the chemical stored energy plants need in order to function. And I don't want you to be under the assumption that plants release sugars. No, they store sugars so that they can use those glucose molecules in cell respiration to make ATP. So plants don't actually release sugars. They store them so that they can go through cell respiration in the mitochondria to produce ATP. So that is a general overview of what photosynthesis is. So on this slide, what we're going to talk about is the balanced chemical equation for photosynthesis. So if you look down below here, okay, this is the balanced chemical equation for photosynthesis, and we're going to review this, and it's essential that you know this so you know what the reactants are and what the products are of photosynthesis. So the reactants for photosynthesis are 6H2O plus 6CO2 plus light produces C6H12O6 plus 6O2. So that is our balanced chemical equation. And then when you put the chemical equation in words, it is water plus carbon dioxide plus sunlight produces glucose and oxygen. Okay, so it is essential that you know the balanced chemical equation for photosynthesis, as well as you know the equation for photosynthesis in words. All right. Okay, so now what we're going to talk about is where does photosynthesis occur in plants, bacteria, and some protists and algae that all go through photosynthesis. And in eukaryotic organisms, photosynthesis occurs in organelles called chloroplasts. Now, yesterday you should have all watched the recorded lecture on chloroplasts versus mitochondria. And that video went a little more in depth in regards to the structure and function of the chloroplast. But again, what you need to know is photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts, okay? And chloroplasts contain light-absorbing green pigments called chlorophyll, okay? And from the video, you should have learned that here's our chloroplasts, okay? And chloroplasts contain these green flattened discs called thylakoids, and inside these thylakoids are chlorophyll, okay? And those are those light absorbing green pigments, okay? So here's our chloroplast. Inside the chloroplast we have these green flattened discs that contain chlorophyll. Now, just to kind of recap where we find chloroplasts, here's our plant cell right here. You know this is a plant cell because it's rectangular in shape or brick-like. Also, you know that it's green. Okay, so that tells us that it contains those green pigments called chlorophyll. So here's our plant cell, here's our chloroplasts. You can see those green flattened discs called thylakoids. And then if we break it down even more and take a little more in-depth look, you have your single chloroplast, you have the inside is the stroma, so that's the fluid-like portion inside the chloroplast. And then you have these green flattened discs called thylakoids. The thylakoid is going to be where the light-dependent reaction occurs, and then your stroma is going to be where the Calvin cycle occurs, okay? So that is where photosynthesis occurs. It occurs in these chloroplasts, all right? So now we're going to talk about the driving force or the energy source for photosynthesis, and that is sunlight. So light is a form of energy. Sunlight is a mixture of all the different colors of visible light in the light spectrum. So if you look at this diagram down here, these are all the wavelengths of light in nanometers. Okay, you could see violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. So these are all the different wavelengths of light. Okay, and so what we need to understand is that in photosynthetic organisms, chlorophyll is the principal pigment. Okay, so that means chlorophyll is the main pigment found in all photosynthetic organisms, and that's why all plants appear green, is because they have this green pigment called chlorophyll. Now here's the thing, why do plants appear green? And that is because chlorophyll, the green pigment, absorbs all blue light, violet light, a little mostly orange light and red light, but what it does is it actually reflects the green wavelength of light. So what I'm trying to say is plants absorb the violet wavelength of light, the blue wavelength of light, the orange and the red wavelengths of light. However, they reflect this green wavelength of light. And as a result, because plants reflect green light, that is why plants appear green. So imagine the sun being up here, okay, and the sun shining down on this plant. The plant is actually absorbing that violet light, that blue light, that orange light, and red light. However, the plant, what it's doing is it's reflecting that green light because of chlorophyll. And as a result, what happens is because the green light is being reflected, that's why it appears green. And that's what we're actually seeing. We're seeing that green wavelength of light being reflected. And that's why plants appear green. So pretty cool. So now what we're going to get into is the structure of chloroplasts. So chloroplasts have a complex internal structure that includes thylakoids and the stroma. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to break down this chloroplast organelle right here. So the thylakoids are sac-like photosynthetic membranes that contain chlorophyll and other pigments arranged in stacks called grana. So here's the thylakoid right here, just one single stack, okay, is your thylakoid. All right, the thylakoid contains chlorophyll, so inside these thylakoids are little green pigments. Now, if we take an entire stack of thylakoids, that is called a grana, okay? And then the reason why I want to go over thylakoids is because this is where the light-dependent reaction occurs. So again, chloroplast, and inside the chloroplast we have thylakoids. The thylakoids contain chlorophyll, and it is here within the thylakoid where the light-dependent reaction is going to occur. Next, we have the stroma, which is the fluid portion of the chloroplast here. So any open space inside the chloroplast will be stroma. It's a fluid-like substance. And the reason why we talk about the stroma is because that is where the Calvin cycle occurs. And both of those are two parts of photosynthesis that we're going to talk about later on. But I just want to reinforce that right now. Let me go back. Okay, so again, here we have an inside of the chloroplast. So here's our chloroplast. Again, we have these green flattened discs, kind of look like pancakes. They're called your thylakoids. A stack of thylakoids is called granum, okay? Again, if we cut those thylakoid stacks open and we see the inside, that would be where the green pigment's chlorophyll would be found. Also, if you see this lightish like membrane, that is where the light dependent reaction is going to occur. It's all in the thylakoid membrane. And then the fluid like portion inside, which we find all around here, is called the stroma, and that is where the Calvin cycle occurs. So again, stroma is the fluid like portion inside the chloroplast. Thylakoids are one single flattened green disc. Granum are multiple thylakoids stacked on top of one another. Okay, so on this slide, what we're going to discuss is we're going to break down the actual process of photosynthesis into two different parts. Those two parts would be the light reaction and the Calvin cycle. And how we're doing this is we're simply just breaking down the word photosynthesis into its two parts. Photo, which means light, and synthesis, which means to make or to produce. So first, what we're going to start with is the light reaction, or the photo portion of photosynthesis. And to show you where we're actually at during this process and where this process of the light reaction is taking place is right here. Okay, so here's our chloroplast. This is the site of photosynthesis. And inside the chloroplast, we have these green flattened discs called the thylakoid. And the light reaction is going to occur on the thylakoid membrane. Okay, so that's where the light reaction is going to occur and take place. So let's get into the actual process of the light reaction in our diagram here. So in the light reaction, we're going to have two key components. We're going to have light and water. And when we combine the water molecules and light, what we're going to produce is we're going to produce ATP and NADPH, which are stored energy, as well as we're also going to produce oxygen as a byproduct, which is going to go into the atmosphere for humans and animals to use to breathe, which is super important. So again, the light reaction requires sunlight and water to produce ATP and NADPH, which are stored energy molecules, as well as oxygen, which will be produced out into the atmosphere for humans and animals to use to breathe. Okay. The second process or part of photosynthesis is the Calvin cycle. So in the Calvin cycle, the main goal is to produce sugar, okay? And that sugar is called a glucose molecule. So how do we produce glucose in the Calvin cycle? And what we're going to do is we're going to take ATP and NADPH, which is produced from the light reaction, and we're going to combine those two energy molecules and combine it with carbon dioxide, CO2, to produce sugar for the plant. Okay, so essentially by going through the light reaction, we produce the two reactants for the Calvin cycle along with carbon dioxide to produce sugar, aka glucose, which the plant is then going to use in cellular respiration to make ATP or energy for itself. Okay, so these two parts of photosynthesis work together to ultimately go from light energy to chemical energy so that the plant can use this chemical energy to make ATP for itself, which is super important. So essentially that is the breakdown of photosynthesis, and we are going to be going into this process more later in the week.